Let's talk about the peace movement. Whatever happened to the peace movement?
The crowd here in New York City is quite larger than they had expected. We know right now that they are blocking off from 52nd Street all the way.
According to the French academic Dominique Remy, in 2003, just before the US invasion of Iraq, 36 million people across the globe took part in almost 3,000 anti-war protests. Whatever happened to the peace movement? The total number of Ukrainian and Russian troops killed or wounded since the war in Ukraine began 18 months ago is now nearing 500,000, according to US officials.
It was unstoppable after the collapse of the Soviet
Why the
Union.
silence? Why do we not march down the streets to demand an end to this war? Whatever happened to the peace movement? David Cortright is an American scholar and peace activist. He's a Vietnam veteran who's currently Professor Emeritus and Special Advisor for Policy Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs and Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 22 books. David Cortright has a long history of public peace advocacy and the prevention of war. Your areas of expertise, David, is non-violent social change, nuclear disarmament, use of multilateral sanctions and incentives as tools of international peacemaking. You also served in the Vietnam War, and I'd like to start there. How did that, your experience in the Vietnam War, how did that shape your views on war and peace?
Well, profoundly. I always tell the story to my students that my journey to peace movements and peace scholarship was an unusual one because it started by being drafted into the Army in 1968. And I didn't know much about the war. I was mostly trying to avoid going into the infantry. But the more I learned about the war and talked to the veterans coming back, the more appalled and shocked I was at how unjust it was, and the extraordinary level of violence and killing that was underway there. And so I felt that I could not continue participating and serving in the military, but didn't know really what to do exactly. And so I just started speaking out against the war as a soldier. As you can imagine, ran into quite a bit of opposition from the commanders. And but there was a time in 68 and 69 when many other soldiers and veterans were having deep doubts about this war, and a movement emerged within the military, a GI, soldiers and veterans movement. And so I was part of that, and I spent my 3 years in the military, most of it as a peace activist. And that set me on a path of understanding the problem of war and the need for peace. And I've really dedicated my life to trying to understand more about the causes of war and the foundations of peace building, and was involved in quite a lot of different peace organizations and campaigns and policy initiatives for prevention of war and peace.
Yeah, let me say this to you. I'm a South African. I grew up, of course, with images of, I really grew up with American culture, I believe. When I grew up, we grew up with Elvis Presley. We also grew up with images of the Vietnam War. And this is my first opportunity in my entire life to actually meet somebody who'd actually served in that war. So please forgive me if I'm going to dwell on that just for a few seconds. So the obvious question that I want to ask you is, did you see experience was part of the violence of the war? Did you experience the violence of the war?
I was in the States. Yeah, I was in the States during that time. I managed to avoid getting sent over. By 68 and 69, the beginning of the withdrawal process was underway. And increasingly, the military was beginning to decay from within. And so the whole time that I was there, it was one of constant chaos within the forces. And the African-American soldiers were in rebellion. There was drug use in many units, and there was open dissent and resistance and refusal to follow orders. And that was sort of my milieu within the military, was part of that dissent and the opposition.
What was it, the abhorrence of the violence of the war that disturbed you much, or how much of the lies around the war? and in fact the kind of nonsensical reasons why America was in this war. How much did that play a factor?
I think it was the deceit. And when I talked to the veterans coming back, that sort of planted the seeds of doubt. And they talked about what was going on. And they didn't give you a political analysis, but just the violence, the chaos. And that set me to doubt and began to raise questions for me. And I started to read about the history of Vietnam and started to look into the news. And it became so obvious immediately that what our political leaders were telling us was completely off base and wrong, and that we were being lied to, and that all of us had been drafted into the military over a lie, and one that was brutalizing these people in Vietnam who we had no argument with them. I read a biography of Ho Chi Minh. I remember this vividly. I'm in the barracks of the army and reading this book about Ho Chi Minh, and I greatly admired him. You know, I began to think, well, this is sort of the George Washington of Vietnam, founder of a nation, and now fighting against the foreign invaders, and we were the invaders, you know. So it was like my whole world got turned upside down. You know, nowadays in America they have this thing about, you know, all these people are woke, you know. Well, I felt like I was being awakened to the reality of the world, and also resenting and angry at the deceit and the blatant disregard for reality and truth that our political leaders were exhibiting, and forcing all of us to respond and be part of their lie. So
you can imagine myself, like many millions others, we've seen loads and loads of Hollywood's interpretation of Vietnam in many shapes and forms, and we've seen a lot of information about it, and it's kind of part of my consciousness today. My question to you today, and there's a reason why I'm asking you this, because of America's involvement in war, I guess, throughout so many years, is how much is the Vietnam experience still part and parcel of, let's call it, the American consciousness today?
Well, I think it's there. I mean, the younger generation, you know, when I have talk about Vietnam in the class, I realized that for them, the Vietnam War is as distant as World War I was for us, or more, 50 years or more. And so it's not something they know much about, but the culture of dissent and of liberation that emerged within society at that time is certainly relevant. And the fact that I guess we were innocent in American culture, and when everyone realized that we were being lied to, that our politicians were deceiving us, and that we had this problem of militarism in the heart of American politics, you know, that awareness, I think, is quite profound. It very much surfaced when we invaded Iraq, and there was a big opposition to that war, and I see it a little bit now. It's less now, however, and I think in many respects, maybe as the time goes on, fewer and fewer Americans have connections to the Vietnam experience, you know, and we don't remember what it's like to be involved in a war of aggression of this nature that we're seeing, for example, with Russia and Ukraine. And we were also the aggressors and the perpetrators in Iraq, as we were in Vietnam.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
It was just over 90 minutes beyond President Bush's deadline for Saddam Hussein to leave Iraq that U.S. warships and planes, there were F-117 stealth bombers involved, launched the opening salvo of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
So that history about our own sins, if you will, our own imperialist policies, is something that some Americans have, but it's really among the older generations.
Let me just go a little bit back to your career again, your experience with the Vietnam War, the trigger for your decision to involve yourself in the world of peace activism. What did you do? How did you get involved in peace activism, and what does that actually mean?
I went on and got my PhD. For my PhD, I wrote a dissertation, which was the history of the soldiers' anti-war movement. It's a book called Soldiers in Revolt. It's still selling. It's amazing. And that helped me to deepen my understanding. And then I became the director of a group called SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, the largest disarmament group in the US right in the late 1970s and early 80s at the time of the global nuclear disarmament movement, the nuclear freeze campaign here in the US. And so I was very involved in that for more than 10 years. And then I wanted to look into academic possibilities and came out here to University of Notre Dame, where I had graduated as an undergrad. And they were starting a peace studies program, and I became the first visiting fellow, and then have been involved in peace research and policy advocacy ever since. But I've stayed involved, and when the Iraq War began, I joined with a lot of colleagues from the Vietnam anti-war movement and others to create a group called Win Without War, which is a broad coalition to oppose the invasion of Iraq. And I'm still on the board of that organization. And I've involved myself in a lot of different policy advocacy work on, for example, on the whole Iraq issue, that how to counter terrorism without war, and how to look at ways of addressing the underlying roots of violence and conflict. And I've been involved in helping to monitor the peace agreement in Colombia and quite a number of other peace research efforts over the years.
Yeah. Just give me an idea, David, just for my own kind of, to really get sort of an image of you. Are you purely an academic? In other words, you are, in terms, your activism is part of your academia, or are you also the guy out on the street there with your banner and touching your fist in the air?
Yeah, it's really both. I define myself as a scholar activist. Scholar activist, and I write about this. I tell my students about it. And you know, as scholars, we should be as objective as possible, follow the evidence wherever it leads, be rigorous, and look at all sides. But we have values. There's no such thing as value-free research, and we all, even by the selection of our topics, we're making certain choices. And so we should be committed to working to try to prevent war and the violence and injustice that's so prevalent in society, and dedicate our research that hopefully in a way that it will benefit people. It's not just an ivory tower exercise. This is for the reality of everyday life for many people.
Yeah. All right. Let's get to the point why I really invited you here. I made a note of it here. According to the French academic Dominique Ragny, I'm not sure if I say that correctly, between 3rd of January and 12th of April 2003, just before the US invasion of Iraq, 36 million people across the globe took part in almost 3,000 anti-war protests. Now, that's quite impressive, and I remember those days. I must admit I was never part of any actual protest march, but we saw them on our screens. Now, there's a war raging on in the Ukraine, and we see the images on our screens every single day. And what we don't see are these peace marches. And it sort of struck me a little while ago. It says, what has happened to the peace movement?
Yeah, it's fractured, it's confused, it's uncertain. I have my own anecdotes. I was at the conference of the Peace Justice Studies Association here in the US of scholars who look at peace and justice issues. And there were, I don't know, 40 or 50 workshops and, you know, lots of different presentations. I looked through carefully in the booklet. There was not a single one on on Ukraine or Russia. I was asked to give a talk at a conference coming up and for a peace group. And they said, don't talk about the Ukraine war. We're all divided on this. We don't know what to say. So I wrote back and said, well, I've got to say something about it. But it's uncertain because we in the US especially have been accustomed to fighting against American foreign policy. You know, the US has been the aggressor. The American foreign policy has been militaristic. And it still is in many respects. But now we have a war by another aggressor, Russia, an imperialist war, in my opinion, an imperialist policy. And people have difficulty opposing that because they've been so much opposed to the US policy. And the question of the Ukrainian self-defense has tangled people tremendously. I mean, those of us who oppose war need to recognize that aggressive war is one thing, but war for self-defense is a legitimate kind of conflict. It's accepted in international law, and it's a principle that's accepted in most moral teaching. A pacifist, a pure pacifist would say no, and that I can respect that position. No war, no military of any kind. But most of us recognize that the degree of injustice of wars, that really matters. And in the case of Ukraine's fight for self-defense, that is a legitimate act of self-preservation, and they have that right. And so the fact that the United States is supporting Ukraine in that war has tangled up a lot of thinking. Some groups, like in the U.S., Code Pink and some of these groups, are campaigning to stop U.S. and other aid for Ukraine. And I can't really accept that, because that means then you kind of assure the victory of Russian imperialism, and to say nothing of the human consequences for the Ukrainian people and possible risks to people in Eastern Europe who fear Russian aggression as well. So being willing to support a battle of self-defense is one of the big issues that's dividing the movement. The other is that the expansion of NATO and the triumphalist militarist policies of the United States and NATO have been one of the big factors that have motivated this Putin policy. I don't say it justifies it. I don't use the word provocation, because that can have legal meaning, somehow excusing what Russia is doing. But it's undeniable that that policy has led to greater feelings of paranoia and nationalism and militarism within Russia as well. And we see it taking this form of now open aggressive war by Russia. But again, it can't be seen as a justification for what Russia has done. And as I wrote in one of my essays, two wrongs don't make a right. So NATO expansion was wrong, and it never should have been done. We should have figured out some way of working with Russia in a new kind of architecture of security in Europe. And there were some preliminary attempts at that in the 1990s. But quickly, NATO expansion took off in the late 90s, and it's had a predictable effect on Russian security policy and Russian domestic politics. So those are tough issues, but my view is that an aggressive war, an imperialist war, needs to be condemned. And I would like to see more opposition by the anti-war movement to Russia's actions. Why aren't we demonstrating in front of Russian embassies and Russian missions around the world on a consistent basis? I think back to, from South African context, many of us were part of the Free South Africa movement in the 1980s, in which we campaigned and demonstrated at the embassies of South Africa and their missions and consulate offices as a way of demonstrating our opposition to the apartheid policy. Did it have any effect? Who knows? But at least it was visible and there was action. We don't see that now. And I don't think you should underestimate the effect of that, even just on the psyche of the South African people. I have a very close understanding of that. But you mentioned Code Pink. I recently spoke to Medea Benjamin, and listening to you, I get more and more confused in my search for the truth. Because I can't understand how come. I can understand that it's a complicated issue. I understand that there's a discussion about who's to be blamed from this war and what's the background to this war. And I can also understand that you take a specific position in this war. But what surprises me is that there's no anti-war movement to be seen, to be detected anywhere, at least in the Western world, as far as we know. We don't see any. I'm talking about anti-war. I'm not talking about anti-Russia or pro-Ukraine. I really specifically talk about anti-war. We see
None of that. And that seems to me quite remarkable. And I've also read a few times or come across information that would suggest, at least in the city of London, anti-war campaigners wanted to set up meetings and so on and were denied permission to do so by the city authorities or whatever the case might be. So that would suggest to me a certain amount of active suppression of the peace movement, or members of the peace movement for that matter. So I'm going to just ask you that to probe in your own mind again. Why are we not seeing, I just read some of the information here during the time of the George Floyd protest in America, for example. Just by comparison, I read this morning, crowdsourcing consortium saying that up to 15 to 26 million people in the US.
Yeah.
Listen to us, 15 to 26 million people participated in George Floyd protests. I'm not saying it was valuable, or not making a judgment on that, but why this utter, absolute silence?
There's no doubt that all of us are anguished by the war and want it to stop. But the question of what do we say, and the moral issues of on this there's so many shades of gray. I mean, the black and white is, yes, the war should end, but how and what does that mean? So there are lots who would say the way to end the war is to help Ukraine defend itself, and that's the ranking position in NATO countries. Many in the peace movement are saying the way to end the war is to negotiate a settlement. And I agree with that, and I've been advocating that position. But even there, what kind of settlement? Is it just a ceasefire in which Russia stays where it is? Is there some way of trying to negotiate for a settlement that's just and where these occupied territories are given a chance to decide their own fate? So there are nuances there. The question of who negotiates? Is it just Russia and Ukraine? What about the role of the United Nations? What about other countries like China, South Africa, and others that have said they want to host and help to pursue a negotiated solution? So I would think putting much more energy there and trying to build a campaign. But it's hard for movements. Movements are out in the streets and they chant slogans, stop the war, don't invade Iraq, end police violence against African Americans. It's harder to say negotiate a solution. And although I think we should still try and still should be out and confronting officials in the US, but also Russia. So if we had a protest in front of the White House, there ought to be one in front of the Russian embassy as well. And, my own view would be that the US and other countries, as I mentioned, China, South Africa, Brazil, Turkey, should take a more proactive stance. I mean, there really should be I wouldn't call it an imposed peace, but there needs to be an international initiative of large scale, and in which countries come together, even if Ukraine and Russia don't come to the table initially, but carve out what is the basic framework of an agreement. And there's a lot of understanding of what that's going to require. And then begin to work politically within Russia, Ukraine, to try to make this happen.
Let me interrupt you here, and let me say something that I may come across rather cynical at the moment, and that's not my intention. And what I want to say before I ask you my next question is in fact that I have just ginormous respect for whoever is fighting for peace in this world. What can be more pure? What can be more wonderful to say I'm a warrior for peace? But isn't peace ultimately also, at the end of the day, in the hands of justice and the truth? And I hear, and I've got an idea of what your position is in terms of this war. But my question is, can we come to peace überhaupt if we do not seem to have much information, or seem to have, at least in the public domain and the narrative that we read about in the Western world, much of an understanding of the causes of this war, or at least, to make it more directly, a dismissal of the Russian position with regard to this war?
No, I agree. There needs to be greater understanding. I mean, in all the things that I've said about the war, I've always emphasized that the aggressive expansion of NATO and the militarist triumphal position of the West has been a significant factor in creating the political climate that led to this war. I absolutely agree with that. And so it means that the solution to this war can't be more of the same. That especially Ukraine, I would argue, should not be invited into NATO. And then there needs to be a refashioning of the security relation between NATO and Russia, so that Russia is more of feels an equal role, a partner relationship, not a subject relationship.
Yeah.
So those are real factors. But on the other hand, how can we justify in any way this kind of blatant act of aggression and the kind of horror that Russia is imposing on Ukraine?
Yeah.
And a threat that also is felt very acutely in Europe. I was in Sweden for a couple of months this year, and I was struck at how Sweden, a country distinguished by its foreign policy of international cooperation and peace, is now eager to join NATO. And of course, the other states, there's a real fear that this policy of aggression is part of a broader design, and Putin has said it, even, to return to the Russian Empire. So, it's like, I think a lot about...
I really want to interrupt you, because I'd like to challenge you, if you allow me, that I'd like to challenge you on the idea that Putin has expressed, at least publicly, or it's on the record, that he wants to build an empire, or that he wants to expand the might or the scope of the Russian Federation. I have spoken to people like Jeffrey Sachs as well, and I listen to people like Professor Meersheim as well. And my understanding is that we say that's our claim, but there's no public record of Putin's intention to enlarge in any way the Russian Empire, or that he has any imperialist designs here. It's a very straightforward narrative that we're being fed by the Western media, but very much not talked about is, in fact, and why I put so much emphasis on this, and maybe I'm doing it in a fairly clumsy way, is because I don't believe we can come to a point of peace if we don't actually understand and respect the background to this war as well. I think that if
I grant that
part of the discussion, then we'll never have peace.
Yeah, I grant you that. I agree. And that's why I think that the concept of what a peace would look like has to have some understanding of the role of NATO, and to not expand further, to try to put Ukraine in NATO, and then also to figure out what is a security relationship, so that Russia is not feeling so isolated and so threatened by the power of the West. So and we need to appeal to Russia. Russia is not just Putin and the war makers in the Kremlin. There's 140 million people. And there's a substantial number of Russians who are strongly opposed to this war. And so we need to find a way to appeal to them, to support the many Russians who fled because of the war, the many who are in the military, even resisting the war and questioning the war, and find a new relationship with Russia, which is more on an equal basis, and recognize that it was a profound mistake to confront them and to fail to develop kind of a equitable architecture of security for Europe in those days. Yeah, it was a profound failure, I agree. And that part of the analysis, I accept. Problem is, we are facing this brutal war of aggression now. So what do we do about it? And to accept it in any way is equally dangerous, in my view, and will only deepen this kind of imperialist politics and its influence in Russia. There was a brief moment when it was more democratic and more open to the West. We have to somehow find a way to get back to that policy that went on for a while into the 1990s.
Yeah. Do you think that we are objectively informed by the media in the West, by the mainstream media, about this war?
No, not at all. It's very one-sided, and there's no reference at all to the NATO discussion, or not, very little, and not enough understanding of the ways in which Russia does have a legitimate security interest to be able to function without being threatened by Western military power. And it also needs to be, as I say, my view is that go back to the vision, essentially what Gorbachev had, and it was present also in the early Yeltsin years, for actually a cooperative relationship. And there are many things that we can do together with Russia from the West. So that's been lost. And we need to come back to that and understand that Russia's not going to go away. It has a legitimate history. It's been an imperial state, and it still is, in my view, today. But we have to find a way to deal with it and respect its legitimate interests. So.
I have a fairly clear understanding of your view on this. I just want to push a little bit on this from, I once again, and I think it comes down to my roots, where I come from. We grew up in a world in which part of the world that was colonized, and was at the receiving end of Western behavior, to put it in sort of decent terms. My understanding of this war is that I do not believe that it could end until such point at which we have a balanced kind of a view on what has truly happened here. And I have to weigh that also against the recent history of America's foreign policy as well. It's clumsy and difficult for me to put it to you as an American, and I always feel uncomfortable about it. But after all, it was the Americans that invaded Iraq. After all, it was the Americans that caused the death and destruction of close to 1 million people in that part of the world. It's the Americans who's been actively involved in something like 85, I think, military interventions since the 80s or the 90s or something like that. So I just and I'm talking to you as a man of peace, a peace activist. I can just simply not understand how that it doesn't become part of the equation in our view of this war. In fact, the question I want to ask you, and forgive me for my bluntness, is: do you really believe that we still believe the American spin doctors on these wars in the world? Do you still believe, after you've been told the lies of Vietnam, the lies of the Iraq war, the lies of Libya, the lies of chemical weapons in Syria, the disaster of Afghanistan, and knowing at the end of the day, and this is something I asked Scott Ritter, is your president, your country, your government has the power to stop this war tomorrow if they wish to do so, by just stop funding this war. I'm trying to make you as a peaceman, and forgive me if I'm so blunt about it.
I've opposed American foreign policy at every turn, and I've opposed these wars. I led campaigns. I took risks directly during the Vietnam War to speak out as a soldier, and I've worked to counter American imperial foreign policy. The United States is the world's biggest imperial power, absolutely, and almost all of these conflicts have had disastrous consequences because of our involvement in them. So I'm adamantly opposed to American imperialist foreign policy, but I'm also opposed to Russian imperialist policy. And I think if we just ended the military aid to Ukraine flat out, it won't end the war. It'll just assure that Russia will win, and the Ukrainians will suffer even more.
What, in your view, if I may ask you that, would a win mean for the Russians? What do you think the Russians are trying to achieve then? I want to ask, and I put it against this background. The Russians and the Ukrainians did come to some form of a peace agreement 2 or 3 months into the war, in which Putin made it quite clear that he's not interested in the Ukraine. He does not want to take power in Ukraine. For that matter, he at that point was quite ready to go back to the Minsk agreement. He was not even interested in the eastern provinces. I'm just, please.
But they have occupied and annexed 20% or so of Ukrainian territory, and they are fighting and determined to hold on to that territory. And, that's what their aim is. It's an imperialist aim to take over part of the territory of another country and incorporate it into Russia. So that's unacceptable, just as the American invasion and occupation of Iraq was unacceptable. And there's no justification for what we did, and what Russia is doing now in Ukraine is equally unjustified. And
yeah.
What about those and anti-imperialists? Yeah. We oppose all imperialism.
Yeah. What about the people of those regions who, since 2014, had begged Russians to get involved, and the fact that they actually did have a referendum, and the fact same thing that happened in the Crimea as well? Why is it okay if the people of Kosovo has a referendum and want to be respected for their choices, but the people on the eastern part of Ukraine not?
Yeah, well, but a referendum held under Russian military occupation is hardly something to rely upon.
Well, I don't
especially
know.
When hundreds of thousands have been driven out of the people who used to live there. So I think some kind of a process for the people of those regions of Zaporizhia and the other areas to be able to decide their future would be appropriate. But how do you do that and give a voice to the people who actually lived there before the invasion? And I don't know how that can be worked out politically. It's complicated, but I'm sure it's doable. But it has to be under international supervision. It has to be under UN or some other authority, not under Russian military occupation, really. So let's be serious. We need to have a political solution, absolutely. And there needs to be an end to the war. But we can't condone and accept Russian imperialism. The consequences of that, I think, will be grave for international security broadly. And so we can be critical of American foreign policy, as we should be. We need to find a negotiated solution, as I mentioned, through international participation. We can do more to support the Russian anti-war voices and the opposition, who are the people who have fled. But we also need to be clear. I think that Ukraine's fight is a just fight for their self-defense. And if we can help them, we should. And I think that's a legitimate position.
It's a difficult discussion. I think we need to start slowly but surely bring this to a closure as well. Just would you agree with me, as a kind of a minimal request from my side, and I'm doing it as politely as well I can, to say that the current narrative about the war in the Ukraine is very much skewed and does not really reflect the concerns of the Russians at all, and that, I'll put it the way some of my American friends, Medea Benjamin, puts it, how would America have felt if it was missiles put on the territory of Mexico, for example? That kind of encroachment. I think the comparison is made to the Kennedy-Khrushchev clash back in the 60s. Are we not just simply ignoring that part of the discussion?
Yeah, I agree. There's more to the discussion, a lot more. The idea that this is a global battle against democracy and of democracy versus autocracy. Ukraine is freer and more democratic than Russia, but it's hardly a paragon of great open democratic society. That's got its own problems. But again, so I agree. There needs to be more of a critical perspective, more of an understanding of the issues involved, and the United States, I think, can apply pressure on the Ukrainian side to take some concessions and be willing to negotiate a solution, because they're not going to be able to defeat Russia militarily. And the only solution is a political negotiated solution, and figure out a way to allow the people of the region, as you were saying, if there's going to be some self-determination, figure out what that looks like through an actual legitimate referendum process. Those are tricky issues, potentially risky on all sides, but I think it's worth pursuing a diplomatic political solution in a much more rigorous way. And try to make sure that we can get a solution that then creates a different security or framework for Russia and for the West, in which both sides will feel satisfied and there'll be some recognition of their legitimate interests. But military aggression has to be stopped, and that's what's going on here. So
I'm going to stop abusing your time and ask you one last question, and that would be, as a man of peace, the cynical person in me tells me that that we live in a kind of Darwinian world, the guy with the biggest gun is the guy who rules at the end of the day. Here's my question. Is peace a good business model, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we know that just societies prosper much more economically, socially, and every other way in peace rather than war. War is the worst outcome for any society. So we have to try to end this war as fast as possible. I agree.
Yeah. David Cortright, thank you very much for talking to me.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
All right, yeah.